Welcome. Thanks so much for joining today for our discussion, the second in our series that we're doing about medical technology, the future of medical technology with OSG. I'm David Levine. I lead our MedTech team here at OSG. So I spend all my time focused on medical devices and diagnostics, and specifically how customers think in these spaces, how customers are making decisions that we use to help our customers make business decisions about innovation, about commercialization, about customer experience, centering it all on how the customer makes decisions. And I think one of the most exciting things about focusing on MedTech as it relates to understanding customer decision-making is the complexity of who the customer is. When we're thinking about medical devices, when we're thinking about diagnostics, we're thinking about a range of customers involved in any decision. And what we're talking about today is how technology itself, and specifically connectivity, changes who that customer is and the role of that customer. I'm really excited about our panelists today. We have a great group of people who we've worked together for years in different capacities at different companies with very challenging strategic areas getting to the root of a customer understanding. So I'm really interested in the discussion we're going to have. I'd like everyone to introduce themselves, starting with Tanmay. Can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, David, for having me here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tanmay Mishra. I'm a Senior Director of Product Management and Strategy at NeuroPace. We are the only brain-responsive neurostimulator for treating drug-resistant epilepsy on the market. I lead our upstream marketing team. Prior to this, I've spent many years at Becton Dickinson in Varian, where I know David from, on a number of strategic projects that we've worked on in product management and corporate strategy, and excited to be here.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tanmay. We also have Ronak Chawla. Ronak, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ronak Chawla. So I currently lead our digital products global marketing team for one of our reported businesses here at Bachelor. We're focused on the critical care setting specifically. So therapies like chronic renal replacement therapy and other organ support therapies. Prior to Bachelor, I worked at other multinational firms where I came across Tanmay and David as well, those being Becton Dickinson BD, as well as Abbott Laboratories. Prior to my time at those companies, I was in the startup world for a little bit, and then before that was an academic researcher. So I've spent my entire career in healthcare, and needless to say, I'm excited to be part of this panel.
Thanks so much, Ronak. And we also have our own Corey Nordstrom. Corey?
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. So I'm Corey Nordstrom. I work on David's team over at OSG. I focus specifically on MedTech as well. And my role here really revolves around helping our clients solution and helping work them to look at business a few different ways so we can kind of just help get that better understanding of their customers. Prior to joining OSG, I worked in MedTech and medical device directly, selling for companies such as Medtronic and startups like Axonics, supporting both OR-based procedures and a lot of patient interacting types of devices as well, before transitioning over and supporting MedTech companies. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thanks, Corey. So let's get started. I mean, the discussion is, how is technology changing the customer, who the customer is, your relationship to the customer? So, Tanmay, can you get us start off? Who is your customer? Who do you think of as your customer today?
Absolutely. So in my current business, multiple. So we have the referring physicians who are the neurologists in the community and other settings who are referring these patients as they get diagnosed with drug-resistant epilepsy. Then we have the prescribing physicians who are the neurosurgeons who actually make the decision, or the part of the decision to make to implant this device. And then the treating physician who manages the patient through the care continuum for many years, the epileptologist at level 4 epilepsy centers. And then obviously with chronic disease like epilepsy, patients always a customer, and the importance is changing. And then lastly, but not the least, other administrative parts of the system, the value analysis committees and things like that, that are part of the decision-making process.
Great. And Ronak, what about in your capacity? Who do you think of as your customer?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we're specifically a B2B business. So we think of our customers as hospitals, the providers, and typically those stakeholders range. So it depends on kind of who in the value chain you're talking to in the sales process. So it could be the nurse who is the end user of our products. It could be the intensivist or nephrologist, all the way up to the C-suite stakeholders who we may be communicating with. Additionally, I think the patients who are the end beneficiaries of our therapies are something we think about all the time. And that lens also comes in when we think about our go-to-market approaches.
Great. And Corey, as you think about your career, who are the different types of customers that you engaged with?
Yeah, most definitely. So kind of speaking at it from the perspective of a former device rep, when I started out, it was very much directly driven to the surgeon. So treating it just historically like a end user based sale. But over the time when I was in the space, it starts to really become a much broader group of customers. The nurses who are using the product, the techs, the administration, increasingly patients in certain roles that I was in. So it's really just everybody who's involved in making the decision around your product to actually acquire it, or the people that are really driving it forward so that you can kind of build that adoption and increase usage.
Great. So let's get into technology. How is technology changing this, Tanmay?
So I think the biggest impact technology is making in our business particularly is patients being more empowered and they becoming a more and more important customer that we think about, especially in a chronic disease management situation like ours. Patients needing access to more of their information, they having more influence in their decision making, and us having more access to their behavior patterns and things like that provide additional sources of feedback as we think about our future. I think that's the biggest change that we've seen in terms of who the customer is, or the focus, like the breadth of customers that we think about as technology enhances.
Mm-hmm. And Ronak, how is technology changing how you understand your customer?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll take the lens of product development, right? And especially my group and things I've been involved with in the past. Today, technology is designed more than ever for care around the patient. So when you think about that, you hear things like personalized medicine, individualized therapies, all in that sort of thematic realm. It's all about using data to understand your patient better and leveraging those big data sets to look at patients longitudinally, or at least that's the goal, right? So trying to understand all the sort of data you need across that continuum. The second piece that I'd probably point to is when you think about human factors in design. So more and more you see this topic of consumerization of healthcare. In other words, taking sort of that consumer feel that you get with tech and moving that into the healthcare space. So we're thinking more and more about the human behaviors and the interactions with the systems. So more and more customers are demanding that our systems are easy and intuitive. So I think, even sort of post-sale things like troubleshooting and supporting our products, we have sort of remote serviceability and other sort of technologies that we use to get in touch with our customer and keep incrementing on our product development. So I think that sort of lens is important to have when you think about how technology and interactions with customers are changing more and more.
Can I add one thing to what Ronak just said, David? I completely agree. I think that the desire for simpler to use products, more intuitive, lesser training, but at the same time, I think there is a shift towards more and more patient engagement and products that engage patients in their care more. I think that's the other shift that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. And Ronak specifically mentioned consumerization. Would you say it's gotten that far when we're talking about epilepsy implantables, where it's very intrinsic to the patient and their care management is it still very much in the patient realm, or is there this kind of consumer aspect to it as well?
There is a slight consumer aspect to it, and I think it's going to shift over time. With epilepsy specifically, there's cognitive deficits and things like that that come in the way. But I think there is a shift towards that let's make it simple to use, but at least provide patients with ways to engage in their care.
Mm-hmm. And David, if I could jump in, I think there's also a macro factor now that's affecting all of this, and that is obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, right? More and more, I think, patients aren't in tune with their healthcare and their needs, right? I mean, myself and others on this panel, we've worked in laboratory diagnostics for years, and we understand what a PCR test is, right? But now, a lot of the population does, right? So just kind of the research that was enabled from that, the engagement, et cetera. I think that sort of macro factor kind of underpins kind of all our spaces now in MedTech and the way we should think about, customers and how much they're engaged with their health.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, what was very much an esoteric, narrow, niche kind of area is now common language, is now something that's engaging all of us. And I think on the one hand, there's probably been as always, an increasing blast of information about everything out there. But on the other hand, a deeper engagement with some of these areas that previously people wouldn't even think about. So it's very interesting to see the macro demand impact. Corey, how did you see over your span selling different products, technology shape and change your customer?
Yeah, most definitely. I think a big part of it was just the scope of what you're selling in a lot of ways. Because when you're bringing in these technologies, it can take something that's historically very, I would say, orthopedic focused, a screw, for instance, for lumbar surgery. And it changes that from this is the thread pitch, this is the lengths, these are the tools, to this is how it interacts with potentially this whole infrastructure for navigation and AI, and it just advances that conversation. But outside of that, even kind of more in line with what Tanmay is talking about with these modulation devices, where you're getting so much information about the patient and how they're using the device and how the care teams are interacting with the patient. It's all there, that it just brings this whole picture of the patient, picture of the clinical staff that you didn't have before. And even in the previous example I mentioned with the more advanced technologies that are going into historically orthopedic spaces, you have all of this information, these devices, so you can really, really understand how your customer is using and use that to kind of inform decision making. So when you're interacting with these customers, it's no longer just very basic about this is what the product is, and it just kind of changes the conversation.
That's interesting. Let's dive into that a little bit more. So Tanmay, what types of information specifically are actually available to you now that wasn't before, and how are you using that?
So for us specifically, I think given it's a chronic disease, there's a huge patient component to it. I think with what technology is enabled is us being able to understand behaviors that patients exhibit. There's a burden of care on the patient for ongoing management, but with technology, the example I have is we have a remote monitor that they use for downloading information from their implants. Just understanding how they use it, how often they download, how often it's being uploaded to their care team, things like that we can passively observe and figure out what the underlying reasons are. Let's say, for example, a patient is just not, the majority of patients are not uploading every day. Is there a problem? Do we need a different mechanism of connectivity or automate that process? Things like that we don't find out with stated preferences, but can observe behaviors. I think if technology is enabled that. The second part of this, looking at online support groups and things like that, what people are talking about, I think that's another source of feedback that enables us to understand what the pain points are for patients or what the unmet needs are.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So you're highlighting a couple of things. having this technology becomes a check on itself, right? So because you can observe the utilization of that feature, you can see, do we need to fix that feature? Do we need to make it better, more usable, more relevant? And then also technology opens up a venue for communication that wouldn't necessarily be happening otherwise. Very interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely. I was just going to add, data is data. Mining data for insights is always incumbent on the people. You can almost slice the data any which way to tell a story. So it becomes very important to understand what story to mine from that data and what are we exactly looking for. And I think that's the bigger challenge for us.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Is to make it usable, make it actionable, and not let it misdirect you. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's valuable, doesn't mean it is going to hit you in the face with the right decision to make.
Right.
Yeah, it's very likely to take you in the wrong direction if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Ronak, what about you? I mean, it's a different type of patient, different type of data. What information do you get?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd focus on what Tanmay was talking about with the story, right? I think the story that resonates with your customer can be different depending on who you see as that customer, right? So I talked before about the value chain, right? In terms of the selling process. Now, what we communicate as an organization to nurses and end users might be different from the patient story, might be different from the C-suite story, right? So just understanding that through data. So using market research and tactics that are available today, getting very much at the specific granular details on specific customers' behaviors and attitudes towards certain types of features or capabilities enables us to be better as an organization when it comes to our go-to-market strategy. And I think that's coming to fruition more and more in the industry as, the competition is getting tougher, more and more entrants. You have sort of players that are coming out of nowhere, and each of them are capitalizing on these different tactics. And what that really is from an operational perspective is actually going to those different stakeholders and, putting together a compelling message that resonates, right? So for a C-suite, right, they might be looking for ways that they can enable operational efficiencies in their organization. So perhaps, are there ways that we can cut costs out of our system so that our employees can spend more time around the patient or do activities that better sort of meet the needs of what they're trying to do strategically. So these are just some examples that I think of about how data has really transformed our understanding of the market, and then ultimately how we go to market and interact with these stakeholders and think about our business.
That's interesting. So you mentioned the different levels of storytelling that's coming from the data. We have the patient story, we have the clinician story, we have the enterprise story. To what extent are you thinking about the data in those same terms, the patient data, the clinician data, the enterprise data, or is that not a framework you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters. I do think, right, the end users of our devices is where we get the most feedback from the device itself and that type of data, right? But, when you think about surveys and getting the voice of customer, you really do want to tease out those details, right? So going away from a product level analysis to sort of that customer benefit and value analysis, you do want to think about that data differently about each of those cuts or segments, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So that's an important point. The kind of a limitation is it opens up this very patient-focused data, but the patient is only one part of the puzzle, and you need to go to other resources still to get those broader points of view. Tanmay, what about you? To what extent are you getting data about the clinician, about the system?
So I was just going to piggyback off Ronak from a previous life example. I think, the way we used to think about it in that market, if we think of these three levels of storytelling, different parts of the value proposition, the C-suite cares about the economics of it. That's typically available from studies like cost of ownership or total cost of ownership or sales data. Then the next year is the lab directors, for example, looking at efficacy. does this work? And that's typically, it's a regulated environment, it's available from our approval studies and things like that. And then the other tier, the end user, is the ease of use kind of data, lean studies and things like that. So I think when we put together that story, I think those three levels are how we think about it. And I think that framework applies to most markets.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about potentially the opportunity there of how can we do better listening, expand that way. What about you, Corey? What kind of access to data did you have in the past? What was missing? How did things change?
Yeah, one thing that kind of ties back to what Tanmay and Ronak were talking about was just kind of this new sources of getting feedback from your actual customers or patients, and the sheer volume and availability of that. The thing I think is really interesting about that is it can help provide a kind of a balance to what we always find in MedTech is that the loudest customers' input is oftentimes valued much more. So it can kind of balance that and kind of give you that perspective that, maybe these loud customers aren't representative of the entire market. It helps you not necessarily focus exclusively on your potentially your current customers, just trying to sell to your current customers. But I think the bigger question is really kind of understanding, how to find that balance, ultimately what's important, and kind of are any of these things these people are providing feedback on, do those things really matter in terms of the end results you're trying to get?
Mm-hmm. And as a rep, when you say the loudest customer, in many cases, I assume that was literal. I assume you actually had more vocal customers.
Yeah, you have your most vocal customers. And it could also be potentially KOLs, maybe people that have a legitimate opinion for sure. But when you place too much value on their input, it may not be representative of the whole market. And these additional sources of data, and these additional user level data, real time and reports, whatever it may be, can help provide that balance to see if this is really representative of the market, or are we just serving the potentially the top tier or squeaky wheel.
Right. That's a good point. So Tanmay, how do you think about integrating these different sources of information?
I completely agree with that. Actually, I was going to bounce off Corey's point. I think it goes the other way around too. The loudest customer usually has the most opinion, but I think the thing that a lot of companies do, regardless of size, is they go to the same group of people for feedback. Mm-hmm. And typically, more often than not, that group of people is one segment, whether they're the KOLs or the super users, and things that work for them typically don't work for a majority of the customer base. And that's probably true across the industry. And so just making sure that we are aware of the segment that we are talking to, mm-hmm. I think is the most critical, because you could go completely off on a tangent if you place more importance on that feedback, because that's not where the market is.
Yeah, and if I could jump in on that point, I mean, I think that's spot on. The loudest customers may come from a representative group that represents the top 10% of hospitals in the US or in another region, right? And if you try to tailor your entire portfolio towards marketing to that group, then you're sort of missing out the big bulk of the customers that you could be going towards, right? Which make up the sort of representative sample, right? Essentially the biggest part of the sample. So I think, that's it is really important to think through those considerations, right? And there are those puts and takes. And, going back to Corey's point, I mean, I think it's really interesting that someone in the field can see that, hey, there is a loudest customer, this customer is actually, in terms of volume and intensity, is even, coming at me in my face about certain features or things that they want, right? But, sitting in HQ, right, in headquarters for a MedTech organization, that's the same sort of balance and composure we have to keep when it comes to analyzing these different factors in the market. So I think it's a very important point by both Tanmay and Corey.
So how do you think about balancing this for decision making? Because you have the loud customers, whether they're the vocal customers or the KOLs who have kind of a outsized influence. You also have objective data coming in from usage from actual customers, but limited in the sense of it's the information that's collected. It's not necessarily future looking. And then you can have voice of customer, you can have primary market research to provide this kind of third stream of data. When you're thinking about making business decisions, I know Tanmay, you're very focused on the pipeline. How do you balance these things? How do you think about them working in concert?
So, let me just start with saying I don't think all customers are created equal. As long as we are aware of so stepping back, what's our strategy as a company? Where do we see ourselves 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Are we driving towards growth? Do we want to be at the cutting edge of clinical research? That's, as a company, we need to make that decision. And then what drives that? Do we only cater to our KOL needs? Does that drive growth for us? Probably not. What is the broader segment of our customers saying? Is it ease of use of the product, or is it more patient engagement? How should we, as long as we understand what our growth strategy is, what will enable that, and which part of the customer base's feedback should be more valued in driving towards that strategy? I think that's the triangulation that we need to do internally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just jump in here, and I'd agree with that completely, right? I mean, it's about sort of vetting your strategy and understanding where you want to go as a business. What are those puts and takes, and what will inform the shorter term, midterm, and longer term considerations, and thinking through that. I don't know that there's one sort of business school framework that will solidify that, right? I mean, I think there's the give and take, and there's certain weights and percentages that you may want to consider, right? But in reality, you have to be gung-ho and really in tune with your strategy, right? So that's how I really like how Tanmay started his answer, right? As a company, you really have to have that position and take that position and really set forward on that path. So as long as you have that in mind and you understand sort of that long-term vision and what your North Star is effectively, it enables you to make those decisions along the way that you have to in any business cycle, right? Ultimately. And, that's driven, again, by customers and what their wants and needs are, and also sort of the macro environment factors as well, right? I talked about COVID as one of them, right? But you think about sort of all the different things, whether it be administrative, sort of legal types of considerations, economic considerations, geographic considerations, right? Those are things that you should keep in mind as well at the macro level as you're going through and making these decisions.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing that you need an overarching strategy for your business that guides any kind of decision making. And there's also a recognition that different types of information can inform different types of decisions. It's not necessarily hierarchical that one is better or one is worse, or you kind of have to balance them or weight them. You have to take the type of guidance that's appropriate to the type of information you're getting, thinking about the context that you're operating in, given the macro environment. Mm-hmm. Corey, putting on your OSG hat, how do you think about integrating these types of information for a more holistic point of view, better decision making?
Yeah. And I think it really just comes back down to what we're talking about here, this whole idea of customer centricity, as far as kind of being maybe that North Star, as far as designing products or these value propositions to whether it be your best customer or just a unique value proposition to the different customers that are making decisions around your product. But I think that having that customer-centric approach kind of helps you avoid a lot of these pitfalls. One thing I hear a lot is around what a competitive product may be doing, the advancements that they're making with a competitive product, and having a very customer-centric approach kind of helps you avoid that kind of arms race, if you will, around just trying to one up the competitor. Because with the customer-centric approach, you're really focused on if that stuff actually matters. I mean, or are you not improving it enough by when you make it a little bit better? So taking in all of this data, all the perceptions on really what are motivating your customers, and kind of building strategy around that can help you avoid a lot of the things that may be a big waste of time or undervalued in your market, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's related to what Tanmay said, it's the right customer. It's not every customer. It's not some random customer. It is what you have designed, a customer-centric strategy. You've defined the customer that you're going to approaching, and you're acknowledging that not every customer is the same. And as we think about the different points of view you have, technology gives you the perspective of the existing customer. KOLs may be those early customers, and then you have a long tail that's still important. And I think these different types of information can inform the longer term strategy addressing the customers that you're focusing on.
A lot of the data sources we're talking about right now are much more accessible with your existing customers, and you may not be looking at the customers that you've yet to acquire yet with many of the sources we've talked about.
So it sounds like those are two important watch-outs, making your decisions based only on your existing customer that won't necessarily let you grow new customers, and making decisions based on competitive actions that maybe aren't aligned with your strategy or aren't really targeting the customer that you want to acquire. Tanmay, are these issues you've encountered at all?
Absolutely. I was going to say, I think, and I've learned this from OSG actually, it takes a fair amount of discipline, but understanding what drives choice for each of these segments is the heart of what we do every day. And as long as we have a good understanding of that, I think the product development process and our roadmap prioritization becomes much easier.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I echo that same sentiment. I think it's very important to understand that, right? I think I've been a part of large multinational companies, and we get caught in the trap of defining our segments based on volumes. In other words, all right, we have the smaller customers, the customers that order a medium amount, and the customers that order a large amount of supplies or equipment or devices, right? And in reality, that doesn't speak to their behaviors, right, or their attitudes about certain things, right? So it's not sort of that informed decision making, right? It's kind of just kind of forcing segmentation on those customers versus actually being in tune with what, and having a pulse on the market as to kind of what are those behaviors and how are they changing over time. I think one thing also, David, that I wanted to comment on, and it's kind of the other side of the coin to what Corey was talking about before. You were talking about how when you go and you think about customers, you really have to understand the different dynamics of it and be customer centric, right? You talked about being essentially a leader and not a follower, right? So from a company perspective, as a med tech firm, I think another sort of watch out for us is that customer centricity has to be embedded in everything we do. And that crosses functions, right? So it's not just a marketing task to be thinking about the customer. It's an R&D task. It's a supply chain task. It's a quality task. It's a regulatory task. Everybody has to be in tune with the customers, because customers are everything to us, right? And let's face it, right? I mean, if you're not, right, someone's there to eat your lunch, right? The reality is business is ruthless. And if you're not providing the offering that customers want today, your competitor is right around the corner, ready to offer it to them tomorrow, right? So I think that lens and keeping that customer centricity and things that OSG are doing today and helping organizations to achieve that sort of vantage point or be able to look across those segments is really, really important. And it's a lens and eye that everybody in the organization should keep.
I think that's a really important point. Customer centricity, it's a strategy. It's not an action. It defines how your whole business is oriented. It's not something that marketing does periodically to make sure that you're on target. I think it's a really important point to make. Any thoughts?
On a more practical level, this is back from my product development days, and also I see this very often, asking customers for what they think we should do next. So, okay, if you were to improve this product, what would you do? We'll bring the next incremental change, or coming up with something that the competition is already doing, versus trying to understand really what they're trying to solve. Yeah. So asking for the problems versus the solutions is a mistake I've seen being made more often than you would like. And that's the thing that I watch out for all the time, and I think everyone should, is not going to the customers and asking for solutions, but trying to understand what problems they're trying to solve, because there's so many different ways you could approach the same problem.
Yeah, and if I could just jump into that, Tanmay, that's so spot on and really hits for me, right? Especially in my world, when we think about digital health solutions, typically you're thinking about workflows and plugging in a gap, right? Or allowing for data transfer between sort of one node in the workflow to another node in the workflow, right? And for me, that's a trap that I see all the time. Thinking about, oh, let's design a solution. We have AI, we have all these technologies today. Let's just throw technology at a perceived problem instead of understanding it, more holistically, thinking about it horizontally in the way that our customers would, right? A hospital sees it in terms of care pathways, care continuums, disease states, right? I mean, they're thinking about it broadly across the sort of patient care spectrum. And for us as a company, we fall into a trap of thinking it in a little niche or in a little vertical, right? Versus thinking about it holistically and thinking about solutions that map across the pain points as you see them across that continuum, right? So it's very important to keep that lens in mind. And thinking through the pains and, to the earlier comments, what are the biggest pains, right, that are kind of driving behavior, and having, that in mind when you're thinking about product development, right? Even going back to my R&D days, I think that's very important to think of that as well.
So thinking about the streams of data you're getting from technology, Tanmay, you pointed out, it can be a signal to the pain. On the one hand, that's kind of an objective and possibly very quick identification of pain. But Ronak, to your point, is that signal reinforcing this narrow, siloed kind of mindset, or does it give a more expansive point of view? How do you think about that type of resource, that type of information, how it fits into identifying the problem rather than asking for the solution versus keeping the blinders on, this is my technology, not the focus on the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes a lot into kind of your design in terms of the survey or how you're kind of going out to the customers and thinking about that, right? There's an old adage, garbage in, garbage out, right? So you really need to think through that properly when you're designing these surveys or when you're going to customers and asking questions, right? You can ask the wrong questions. Let me put it that way, right? So you can go and think you're doing a great market research study and or you're doing an ethnographic study, you're sitting with the customers and you're solving a problem that's not really a problem, right? So you really just need to kind of zoom in, zoom out, right? So being at the granular level and then kind of coming back out and looking at it more holistically and then maybe diving back in again, right? So I think it's that balance. You have to go back and forth and think through those considerations because it's not an easy problem, but it's all about keeping your eye on the customer and thinking about it holistically. And then to Tanmay's earlier point, that was really great about kind of what's your strategy, what are you trying to achieve here, right? And then balancing all those factors. So I think it's a complicated problem, David. But it does involve it's very multifactorial there.
I completely agree with Ronak what he just said about the ethnographic part. I think you can't emphasize enough how adept people are at working around problems that they see. And the example I have from the lab diagnostics market, actually, we did a pretty big ethnographic study for one of the products that we were working on. And one of the problems was the different machines in the lab don't talk to each other through a common lab information system a lot of times. And you see all of these machines with post-it notes across these machines just to remind the lab technicians of what to do with samples processed in one machine, it goes to a different step in a different machine. But when you ask them to state that, that's not even on their top 10 list. And so just observing them and getting the implied preferences versus what they state, I think that distinction is so important.
Yeah, and I think that inertia is something you always got to watch out for, right? I mean, change is hard, especially when you're changing workflows, right? So to Tanmay's example, I was right there in the trenches with him in the lab diagnostics world, so I could totally sympathize with that. But in general, right? I mean, when you think about workflows, changing workflows is very hard to do, right? It's changing customer behavior and solving problems that they may not have even readily thought of, right? To Tanmay's point, not even in their top 10, right? And that presents a problem for, companies like where Tanmay and I work, right, where we have to think through that dynamic. How do we present the evidence? What's the go-to-market strategy? Yada, 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 right? But at the same time, that's how we move healthcare, right? We really got to think about that, right? The dynamics around connected care, connected technology, digital health, right? I mean, all of these things are here to stay. And to Tanmay's point, that was a very good example of just, data not being transferred between systems, not being able to kind of have one integrated automated system, right? So there's sort of a use case and need right there, but it might not even come up in your study. So that's why I think, like I said before, I mean, it's that zooming in, zooming out, and really trying to understand all those factors.
It's interesting because I'm hearing it's kind of a dual problem, because on the one hand, you can capture this completely objective behavioral information from technology that maybe it gives you a signal, it gives you a hypothesis, but it doesn't necessarily contextualize it into what it might mean for them. So you need more of a discussion, more of a, understanding the context from the individuals and understanding the bigger picture. But at the same time, the customer may miss the details in the bigger picture, and you need to kind of observe from them to see what are frictions that can be solved. So it sounds like it's different sources of information providing different hypotheses, different signals, and it's kind of up to you as marketers really to synthesize both what would be meaningful, why it would be meaningful, and then how you can communicate it effectively so that people would actually change their behavior to get a benefit from it. So when you frame it that way, it's really a heavy lift.
Well, I think a big part of the question then is still, all of these things that are being out there that are important that they want to change or that you need to change. It's always kind of bringing that lens in of how much does it really matter, though. I mean, there are certain things where people will tell you it needs to be improved in, a certain way, but ultimately that's not the thing that they're most worried about. Their real challenges is another area. And, as a manufacturer, you can't do everything all the time. You can't deliver the ultimate product every time sometimes, because really you just got to get the product out that sometimes they're willing to buy now. The ultimate product might not be something anybody truly cares about or is willing to buy for years and years down the road. So there's a number of different things that need to be considered when you're asking these questions.
It's very important. You need to not just innovate for the sake of innovating. It needs to be there needs to be a desire, a willingness to change, and certainly a willingness to pay. And I assume, Tanmay, that's something you're also focused on in terms of the many inputs you're considering in advancing an initiative forward.
Absolutely. The way I think about this, David, is if people always respond to incentives. And, the example I have, again, from the lab diagnostics market, and I was working on a new product. Training and retraining costs on software products is one of the highest buckets of cost in labs. And when we were doing this research, software training costs never came up. But from the research, you could imply that they didn't want to learn a new software. And so not innovating for the sake of innovating, but truly trying to understand what they're trying to solve. And that, in this case, was extremely different from what I thought would be this problem. And Stanford's design school has this really interesting branch out first graph. You broaden out in the solution space before you narrow down. So there's probably 100 different ways to solve the same problem. In the lab diagnostics market, sample preparation bottlenecks are huge. You could solve that thing with automation, which is what we did. You could solve it with low cost labor. You could do it with many different ways. And so branching out and then figuring out what makes sense for our strategy, I think, is an approach that I think we've taken.
Yeah, and I would just go back to kind of the comments around consumerization of healthcare, human factors, et cetera, right? Training costs is, again, something that I see in my world as well. It's followed me with every company that I've been at, right? Oh, it's got to be easier to use, right? And I think I think that is a dynamic of the old a little bit, right? I mean, there's a little bit of that, kind of designing solutions, very product driven, technical minds going at it and building the best technology they can for a problem versus sort of thinking about those true user needs. but there is now sort of that course correction that you have to think about, right? And map out to sort of your future strategy as well, right? So, you talk about sort of how intuitive and easy to use products have to be in the future, right? But kind of you have to split that gap, right? And to Corey's point, it's a little bit hard, right? Limited resources, limited time as a company, you got to think through those dynamics as well. I mean, that's a very real aspect of business, right? But it's about how you deliver that value to customers, and what is that value and what is that right approach? Tanmay's example, right? Laying out different types of ways to go about it, right? So I think you just really need to be disciplined and think through those considerations.
So thinking through, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to add to what Ronak said. In that example specifically, one of the statements that I heard from a customer, I was doing some usability in Europe, and lab diagnostics market, there's a whole macro trend. There's a group of people retiring. There's a younger population of less experienced lab techs coming in. And one of the lab managers made a comment to me. This was an automation machine. She said to me, I'm really sad that you're taking the art out of this, but I understand why. And that is so telling, because there is inertia, to Ronak's point. There is a group of people, they don't want to change the way they're doing things, but the reality on the ground is changing.
Yeah, and I think part of that also plays into the messaging and the value that you're delivering, right? I think there's also a fear that you're taking away jobs, and that might not necessarily be the case, right? I mean, you're just kind of enhancing the workflow and allowing the staff to work on things that they otherwise probably weren't, or ignoring, or they could better perform in other areas, right? Just as a result of having that time, right? So I think that communication is important ultimately when you come out with that product. Obviously, when it first comes out, there is kind of a shock factor, but it's also important kind of as marketers thinking about that dynamic and how you deliver that value ultimately through the sales staff to the customers.
And so thinking big picture, we have more technology, more automation, more connectivity, more communication. How do you think that has changed the medtech market generally? The fact that there is more technology out there, more of a feedback loop from customers, more interaction. Tanmay, what do you think?
I think the expectation from customers has changed. They expect more from companies. They want quicker product development. They, I think, are less patient to waiting on improvements on products. So I think that's one of the changes that I've seen. People, both patients and clinicians, come in with more knowledge. They triangulate. They have so many different sources of information. These people are going to conferences. They're talking to other KOLs. They have other companies that they speak to. And I think the pace of change is changing, and so is their expectation.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, there's tons of things, right? Social media, access to information, broadly changing the game, right? I mean, it's very easy for customers to be in tune with their health, understand, various factors that they didn't even understand before, lab diagnostics and COVID, right? Something that happens in a basement of a hospital, no one really knew about from the average sort of consumer. But, they just went to a Quest or a LabCorp or any facility, got their tests done and got the results, right? They weren't kind of like, oh, that's a black box. I'm not really sure what goes on behind, but I know it's all right, in range or out of range. But now you really have an understanding and appreciation of kind of what goes on and thinking about healthcare more broadly and trying to do it, be more proactive rather than reactive about your health, right? And that's on the consumer side. I think similarly, kind of in the B2B space, similarly, right? Like, hospitals have more information, access to sort of benchmarks, standards, what do they see as best in class, right? And they're kind of more and more pushing us. And then one other factor is the competitors, right? Your competitors are getting stronger. You have competitors coming out of nowhere, thinking about things differently, right? So it behooves us as a company in the medtech sector to constantly think about our customers, be customer obsessed, and really try to understand how things are changing, day to day with our products, as well as understanding sort of that macro picture, as well as how things are moving, how information is being exchanged, who it's being exchanged between, right? I mean, there's tons and tons of factors. But it's just keeping a pulse on the market that I think is important, because it's not only you, now it's your competitors and emerging competitors, and in places where you think you had huge share, right? I mean, I've seen this in my space. We see it in other spaces as well, right? These people coming out of nowhere, these emerging startups getting tons of VC-backed funding, and then all of a sudden, their revenues are in double digits of millions, triple digits, and then it's like, oh, okay, now I'm going to pay attention, right? So, you need to be careful and cognizant of that fact.
Brings down barriers, improves access. There's pluses and minuses of that for your business. Corey, what do you think? What changes have you observed?
Yeah, well, I think that just one thing from a very practical standpoint is, and I mentioned it earlier a little bit, just kind of these conversations that are happening between the manufacturer and the customer now, they're changing. The nature of the conversation is much more technology focused. You're talking about the integration of data, you're talking about how this actually interfaces, you're talking about UX, you're talking about, connectivity between platforms, and all of these things are, important and valued by your customers. But I think that one thing that it drives is the question of, hey, is my team ready to have these conversations? Do we have the right skills internally to address these things that our customers are caring about? So I think it definitely, brings about some reflection as far as the skill sets that are in the sales org.
Is that something you've seen, Tanmay, Ronak, in your organization, kind of a shifting need for the organization to adapt from a sales perspective?
More to go ahead, Ronak.
No, go ahead, Tanmay. I'll chime in.
I was going to say I completely agree. More from a transactional perspective approach to a more partnership approach.
Yeah, and Tanmay, you stole the words right out of my mouth. Exactly. I mean, it's no longer about being transactional. I think back in the day, more and more hospitals and provider organizations were thinking about things solely based on price, right? Price was the biggest factor. And now the conversation has shifted more to value. What value are you going to bring our organization? We understand here are our top 10 strategic imperatives. How are you in line with those top 10 strategic imperatives? I don't want to work with 10, 15 vendors. I want to work with 5. How do I do that, right? How do you become a vendor of choice? By bringing me a solution set that's comprehensive and thinks through my problems more holistically, right? So I think that's a change that we're seeing more and more, and then I think we'll continue to see. That's also at the backdrop of thinking globally, more and more vertical integration. In the US, we have IDNs, but I'm thinking Latin America, right? More and more of that. You have payers at the table as well, thinking about value-based care, the shift to thinking about outcomes, right, versus just delivering a product or a device or an instrument or something like that. It's more about how are you improving patient care? Is the patient ending up better than they were when they first started with that particular device, therapy, implant, whatever it is, right? So I think we need to be very cognizant of those factors.
Great. I want to make sure we get to some questions. Akila, could you help us out? I know there were some questions in the chat here.
Yes, there's a question from Kevin Lennon in the chat. How are you utilizing omni-channel engagement in customer centricity?
We'd like to start with that one.
So I can kind of start. Again, this is another big topic. People on my team are looking into this extensively. The broader team, I mean, and this is something that we've talked about, and it's something that's more and more important. So in terms of how we're looking at it, right, I go back to the comments we made around social media and just more and more access to information. So previously maybe word of mouth was the way information was spread and the way you got information, but now looking at a website or videos, different types of engagement models. I think all of that's important. And then on the back end for us as a company, it's very important to track how we're engaging or how customers are engaging across those avenues. And then also looking across the different stakeholders, right? So we mentioned before about that sort of hierarchy in terms of stakeholders. For me, it's the nurse, intensivist, nephrologist, all the way up to the C-suite, right? So who are those people that are engaging on those platforms? What type of engagement is driving? And then ultimately, it's about translating that into action-oriented mechanisms to deliver outcomes, right? So how are we taking that information in as an organization, looking across the stakeholders and better refining our product development so that the products and offerings meet the needs of our customers? So I think that entire mindset, again, going back to my comments earlier around a mindset and a culture within the organization, I think that's something that we're trying to instill within our organization. And I think more and more organizations more broadly in MedTech are thinking through that.
I completely agree with that. I would add nothing to that.
Okay, so it's yet another source of information we're balancing between to make decisions, but it's also a feedback loop directly for itself. Do we have time for another question, Nikhila?
Yes, we do. There's some anonymous questions in the Q&A. What global or societal factors impact buying and usage behavior?
Yeah, so I can start on that. I think I touched on this briefly before, but when you think about it globally, I know we kind of have a U.S. bias given all of us are based in the U.S. here, but when you think about it globally, there are sort of macro factors that you need to think through, and I touched on some of them, right? So as an organization, for example, there's various administrative types of factors. You look at, for us, we're in a heavily regulated environment. So there's the FDA, there's the CFDA in China, there's the European Union, right? There's various different entities that we have to comply with, and not only sort of comply with, but also start to lead the conversation now more and more, right? So engage early and often during the product development lifecycle. So we're actually meeting the needs in a way that will best be compliant as well as able to enter certain markets. The other things I think about is just in general, reality of business. We think about the economics of different markets, right? That informs our sort of strategy. So that's a huge factor. There's a lot of geographic elements that we think through. So, what's close to home, what's further from home, in terms of markets themselves, and how do we approach those markets? So those are all the things that I would think of. One more is just cultural. I think of various examples, maybe outside MedTech, where companies have been creative, really immersing themselves in the culture of that particular geography, where that informs or rather wraps around their go-to-market strategy. So they'll go right into that particular country, understand what's the discourse, how are people talking about things, and then they'll put together informed strategy based on that. So I think those are kind of the factors that come to mind for me.
I'll add one more to what Ronak just said. I think the only other one I would add is, in case of chronic diseases, the availability of a support system, a caregiver being part of the equation. Because sometimes the burden of disease is too much for the patient to manage themselves. So, some patients might not be candidates unless they have caregivers that can support them. So that's one that we think about in our business as well.
So thinking about technology, it sounds like as you're going global with any kind of technology, it's not the same everywhere. The rules might be different. The nature of the information you can collect and how you can collect it might be different. And then the interpretation and the context is very different in terms of what types of how to interpret what you're learning, how advances might be received, and how patients might be able to engage. And of course, practice might be very different country to country. So it's interesting to think about the global complexity. I think we're just about out of time today. I really want to thank everybody, Tanmay, Ronak, Corey, for your participation. Really appreciated the discussion. Really want to thank everyone for listening today. I hope it was valuable for you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to continue the discussion offline with each of you. Happy to share the discussion. We'll share a video. We'll be following up. Please reach out if you want to learn more about OSG or continue the discussion, and looking forward to continuing in the future. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.